Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process of assembling your skeleton bird. So this is going to be our final product. We love him. This is Taco, the very first one I ever made. And together, we're going to make a new one. So Taco's going to go sit over here. The astute viewers among you might notice that this is a different layout than resulted from the previous video. And that's because the previous video, I realized unfortunately too late, was using an older version of the cut file. So you will have access to this beautiful updated file, but you'll still follow the same process as outlined in the previous video. To get us started, we're going to go ahead and go over some of the materials that I found useful in assembling the skeleton bird. Number one are a variety of paper manipulating tools, like an X-Acto knife, or tweezers, or a little spatula for getting things off of the cutting mat. You're also going to need glue, and I highly recommend picking up some tacky glue from your local craft store or Walmart. This is going to have a much lower liquid content, and it's going to get sticky faster, which makes it much easier and much faster to assemble all of the finicky little pieces that go into this project. I'm also going to be using a little tray. So this is just the top of a little condiment tub. This tray I'm going to squeeze my glue into, so I have an easier time manipulating just a tiny bit of glue, and I'm going to be applying my glue using a toothpick. You're also going to need wire, which is the backbone of your skeleton. I highly recommend using 20 gauge. It is the smallest gauge that is going to be good at holding itself up under pressure and is still easily moved with just your fingers. Now you can see I'm using copper wire, and that's because I'm going to be soldering my skeleton together. If you would like to use glue for attaching your skeleton, you need to make sure that your glue will attach to metal. So something like E6000. If you're not going to be soldering, you don't have to use copper wire. You can use any crafting wire that you find at your local craft store. For instance, this artistic wire that I got at Michael's. And that's actually what I used when I made my first model. Some wire cutters and pliers are useful for bending those specific bends that we need. A ruler is going to be handy. And last but not least, you're going to need your actual cutout. So our first step, we're going to get started with making the feet. So for this part, we're going to need these two pieces, and then the 8 talon pieces that are here off to the side. I'm going to get those off the mat very carefully. So our first step is going to be folding our feet along the score lines. Obviously, that's going to be exceedingly hard to see on screen, but there are lines pushed into this paper that are not cut all the way through. And those are just going to help us bend at the proper places. So on these feet, we have one that goes all the way down, one on either side, and then one in between each of the toes. We're going to start by folding right along the middle. And it can be very helpful when you're folding these to have a flat piece that you can use to bend around. So in this case, I'm using the spatula that came with my Cricut tools. I'm also going to do that to each of the toes. And it's okay if it's not completely perfect. This is a really challenging fold. All we're looking for here is a little bit of a 3D shape to this foot. Once I have that toe folded in half, I'm actually going to push it up against the middle toe and just kind of squish that flat. And that's going to help give us that rounded appearance across the top. I'm going to do that with the other side. And so once I have that done, I have a rounded out foot. I'm going to repeat that for the other foot. Once that's done, I should be able to fold all 3 toes together and squish them so that they're in a nice 3D shape. So when I pull that out a little bit, we have a nice 3-dimensional foot. If you have trouble with the foot folds, don't worry too much. This is the hardest fold, I think, in the whole project. So if you manage this one, the rest of it's going to be cake. The next thing I'm going to do is I am going to assemble each of these 8 talons. So I'm going to fold them on the score line so that they match up. And what I'm going to be left with is this shape. So when we glue this, we're going to want to glue only up to that rounded shape at the end. So we're going to glue all along the claw, and we're not going to put any glue on this round shape here. This is where we're actually going to attach it to the toe, and we want this to be able to flare out so that that toe has the rounded illusion going for it. I'm going to go ahead and fold all of these, and then I'm going to show you how to glue them. Okay, so now that each of these are bent, I'm going to go ahead and glue them together. So remember, we're not putting any glue on that round end part. So to do the gluing, I'm going to put just a little bit of glue in my tray. This dries out pretty quickly, and we're using a very small amount for each glue. So I'm only going to put a tiny, tiny amount in my tray. I'm going to pick it up with my toothpick, and then I'm going to run some glue. I have too much glue even. I'm going to run some glue just on the inside of that talon. Again, not putting anything on that round bit. And then I'm going to squish it flat. And then I'm going to flare out those rounded sides. And you'll see that it's all nice and rounded out. So I'm going to repeat that process for all 8. So our next step is we're going to be adding those talons into each of these little slits. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply just a little bit of glue on either side of that slit. And then we're going to take one of our claws, making sure that the claw is facing in the correct direction. We want the point to go down when the bird is standing up. We're going to stick the claw in. We're going to pinch it flat so that that tacky glue has a chance to grab hold. And then we're going to put it on the table and just move that claw until both the toe and the claw are flush. So we want this to be flat when it's standing. And so this is what we end up with. All right, I'm going to repeat that for all 7 that I have left. Glue, talon, pinch, lay it flat, adjust the angle of the claw. All right, so that one's ready to go. We're going to do the next foot. Now that that's done, we can flare the toes out a little bit. Wait until your glue's a little dry before you do this part. And then, when you lay your claw flat, you've got a nice little foot. I'm going to do the same here. I'm just spreading that tip of the toe out just a little to give it more of a 3D appearance. Oop, and I just noticed that the glue came undone on my back talon. Don't be afraid to add more glue if you need it. From the underside, and from the top, and from the side. Now that we have our feet assembled, we're going to assemble our legs. In order to do that, we need the wire that serves as the bones for our bones. So if you have not modified the cut file and you have printed to the same size that I have, the measurements for your wires are going to be 10 for the spine, 8 inches for the legs, and 6.5 inches for the wings. So you're going to cut 2 6.5, 2 8-inch, and 1 10-inch wires. I have all my wire pieces cut out. If you have modified the size of the print, what you're going to need for the leg measurement, you're going to want at least 1/2 inch that goes into the foot. And then you're going to take the measurements of your leg bones. So this bone, and this bone. So you'll measure this one, and this one. Add those together. Add 1/2 inch for the foot and 1/2 inch to connect it to the spine. For the wings, you're going to want to measure this bone and this bone. And then you're going to add another 1/2 inch for the wrist and 1/2 inch to attach it to the spine. And finally, to get your spine measurement, you're going to measure along this and then add proportional lengths for the tail and the neck and skull. It is far better to have too much wire than too little. It's very easy to trim and adjust, but you can't add wire back. So now that we have our wires cut out, we're going to take all of our leg bones off the mat. So now I'm going to find my leg wires, which are my second longest wires. And I'm going to attach the feet to the leg wire. So I'm going to bend approximately 3/4 inch to make a shoe shape almost. And I'm going to poke that through the cut hole that's on the foot. So you can find it easier if you flex that back toe a little bit. And I find it easiest to actually push through the first time from the underside, wiggle it a little bit, and then put it back through in the correct direction. So I'm going to put my wire through. And what you want for this length is you want it to continue up into that middle toe. Once we've got that through, we're going to bend it just a little bit so that it matches up with the toe as best we can. And then we're going to apply a great deal of glue in here. We're actually going to do this in a couple of stages until that whole underside is almost full of glue. So I'm going to grab a whole bunch of glue on my toothpick. And then I'm going to apply glue into that trough. And then stick my wire down. I'm going to hold this in place until the glue is tacky enough to hold it itself. And then I'm going to set this off to the side to dry a little bit. And then I'm going to repeat the process with the other foot. So I'm going to bend about 3/4 inch. I'm going to find that hole. And to make it easier for myself, I'm going to put it through in the wrong direction to open it first. And then through again in the right direction. I'm going to load up my toothpick with a bunch of glue. And I'm going to fill in where that wire is going to go. And then press that wire into the glue. And hold it still. While that's drying, I'm going to set it off to the side, and we're going to work on the wings for a minute. So the wings are comprised of quite a few bones, and please don't get mad at me if I get this wrong. I am not an expert in bird anatomy, but we have our digits, and we have our simplified metacarpus. We're going to have our radius and our ulna, and we're going to have our humerus. So we're going to go ahead and grab all of those pieces and get them off the mat. So to get started, I'm going to take my digits and fold them along the score line. And then I'm going to do the same with my metacarpus. I'm probably saying that incorrectly. So now that I have those folded in half, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply glue all along the inside of the digits. And I'm going to make sure that I have some glue on both sides at the end, because I'm going to sandwich it around the end of my metacarpals. And when I put this together, I do want it to have a little bit of a curve. So our end result is going to look something like this. Okay. Do not put any glue yet in this one. So again, I'm just going to coat the inside of the digits with a little glue on both sides of the end. And then I'm going to sandwich this around my metacarpals. And the really nice thing about tacky glue is that as it's drying, you can still kind of massage things into the place that they're supposed to be in. And so there's our first one done. We're going to go ahead and do the second. Compare your two to make sure that they're about the same length. And then go ahead and grab your wing wire. Now, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to be putting our wire through our metacarpal and sandwiching the wire inside. So what we're going to need to do is apply glue to both sides of the inside, and then our wire is going to run straight through that fattest part. So let's go ahead and do that. And you're going to end up with something like this. Repeat that process for the other wire and the other wing. The next bone, or should I say bones, that we're going to work on are our radius and ulna. So you'll notice on this that we have a little tab right on the center. This is for stability and to try and keep the wire sandwiched in between those bones. So we're going to start by folding this right along the score line, and then folding that tab along its score line. So what it'll look like once it's fully folded up is this. There are two ends to this. This end is going to go towards the wrist. So this end that sticks out almost like a little golf club goes towards the wrist, and this end is going towards the elbow. When we glue this, we want to apply glue only from here down. We don't want any glue on that joint portion. So this is going to be free moving and bendable. So we need to keep it glue free. The tab, we want to have glue on both the inside and outside portion, because the tab is going to stick both to the paper and to the wire. So we're going to go ahead and put a whole bunch of glue on this. Remember, we're leaving this end free. There's a happy little sweet spot with your glue where it's thin enough that it gets tacky quite quickly, but thick enough that it actually acts as an adhesive. If it's too thin, it won't stick. And if it's too thick, it will take a long time before it sticks. And it can be a little too wet and make your paper flimsy. All right, so now that we've got glue applied all over that, we're going to take our wire, making sure that our wrist portion is down here. It's going to overlap our previously assembled hand, and we're going to just kind of massage this wire until it's about the right shape to fit along that top bone. And we're going to stick that inside, making sure that we catch around that tab and close it up tight. Now, our aim is to sandwich that wire inside that top bone, and that tab is going to act as kind of a backstop so that it doesn't continue to go through. So we're sticking the paper to itself on the outermost bone, and we're sandwiching the wire on the upper bone. And we're making sure that there's a little bit of overlap between what we just did and our new bone. So once that's all squished together, we have a result that looks like this. We're going to repeat that process with the other wing. Okay, now that we've glued the heck out of it, we're going to get this stuck together. Now, on to easier bones. The humerus is much, much easier. We're going to fold this one along its score lines. And with the humerus, this portion that looks, again, like a golf club, is going to be up towards the shoulder, while this end is our elbow. When we assemble this piece, we want to leave just a little bit of a gap between those two, and we're going to apply glue the whole way down. So we're going to find just about where that bone is going to bend and just put a little bend in there ahead of time. And then we're going to apply glue the entire length on both sides. So we've got glue all the way up. We're going to make sure this is relatively straight and then stick this down and sandwich it. We want that wire to be right down the middle of the bone, because we'd really like to not be able to see much of that wire. And there's a fully assembled chicken wing. Now we're going to repeat that with the other one. And there is our other finished wing. Now that our foot has been drying for a little bit, you can see the wire is still pretty exposed because most of the glue is underneath. What we're going to do is take another layer of glue and fully encase that wire so it's a lot less likely that it's going to come out. So we're going to take a pretty heavy application of this glue and go right over top. And keep in mind that this is going to take quite a while to dry, so be prepared to be patient. If you wanted to do this with hot glue, more power to you. I just find that hot glue tends to be pretty messy and imprecise. I'm going to repeat the process with the other foot. Now that our feet are fully dried, we're going to go ahead and start assembling our legs. So we have three main sets of bones. We have our tarsometatarsus, our tibia and fibula, and our femurs. So if those are still on your mat, go ahead and take them off. We're going to start with the tarsometatarsus. For this bone, we want to fold it along our score marks, and then we're going to fold each of these tabs in. So just like with our wings, these tabs are going to help keep the wire inside our little paper sandwich. So once this is folded up properly, you're going to have a result that looks like this. We're going to do that to both. And our connection points are going to look like this. So when this is assembled, this little part shaped like a high heel is going to wrap itself around the foot. So we're not going to actually put any glue on this portion. And that ends up looking something like this. So we're going to just adjust the angle of that wire so that it sort of matches and makes it easier for us to glue this down. Much better. So we're going to apply glue all the way up, but we're leaving the little high heel glueless. And remember to apply glue on both sides. To attach, we're going to line this up and encase that wire as best we can right down the center, and then just kind of slide it down to where it's over our foot. And make sure that we have one high heel on either side. Squish it down really, really well, and while that dries, we're going to do our other foot. If you notice that the front half of your leg is coming apart a little bit, you can always add just a little bit more glue to reinforce. We want to leave that high heel portion open so that we can adjust that foot a little bit as needed. So that's a pivot joint. We want to make sure that it has the ability to pivot. All right. So now that our tarso-metatarsus is done, we're going to grab our tibia and fibula. So this is going to be our kneecap, and this end is going to go towards our ankle. We're going to make sure that our kneecap is facing forward. When we attach this, we want to leave this end open so that this can also be a pivot joint. We're going to glue the kneecap to itself. So we want that kneecap to be separate from the wire. So once again, we're going to leave off on the glue here, and we're going to glue all the way up on both sides. We're going to have just a little bit of overlap at that ankle joint. We're going to stick this down and fold over and sandwich our wire. And once that's dry, you'll be able to bend this so you have a nice ankle joint. We're going to repeat that process on the other leg. Next, we have our femur. So we're going to fold that one on the score line. We're going to give this one a few minutes to dry and work back on the one that's already dry. For our femur, we have two ends. We have a larger end and a smaller end. This larger end is going to go inside the kneecap. So if we're looking at it facing forward, we're going to have a joint that looks very similar to this. So the large ball is going to be facing this way, and our hip is going to also be facing this way. We're going to have a little bit of overlap on that wire where the ball fits inside that kneecap, and we're going to apply glue the full length. Now that this is dry a little bit, I can show you. This is what it's going to end up looking like once it's bent in the proper directions. All right, we're going to repeat this with the other leg. Ta-da! Now that we have our legs and wings assembled, we're going to work on attaching them to our spine. To get a better measurement for where we need to place our limbs, we're going to go ahead and get the body piece off of the mat. And we're going to need our spine wire. If we bend our spine right along the score line, once we have our body piece folded in half, we can use it to measure where we want to attach our limbs. So when placing our spine along the body, we're going to want about an inch coming out the back, and the rest we want to be coming out the top. When we're attaching our limbs, our legs are going to be positioned right along these holes in the pelvis, and our wings are going to align with this notch between our clavicle and what's known as our coracoid. Sorry, I'm not an expert in anatomy. Our coracoid bone. If you're using glue, this is going to be really, really easy. You're going to bend your wings to a sharp angle, and then you're going to glue them at the appropriate height. I'm going to be using a soldering iron to go ahead and solder my wings onto my spine. And then I'll come back and show you what that looks like. So I have successfully soldered the wings to the spine. So the next thing I need to do is get ready to attach the legs. So to do that, I'm going to open this up, make sure that the clavicle is separating on either side of the wire, and I'm just going to stick the arm through that little notch. And this is where I need to attach the legs. I need to make sure that the spine is bent in the same kind of arch that it has for the body. And then this is where it gets a tiny bit tricky, because what I need to happen is I need the legs to be attached through these holes. So when I do this, I'm going to bend the legs at a sharp angle, just like I did with the wings. I'm going to stick them through that hole, and then I'm going to solder or glue. And I'm going to come right back after I've done that. So here you can see a close-up of that solder job. You can see the wires of the legs go through those holes in the pelvis. And then this is what it looks like from the back side. And you can see the connection points of the arms. With our wire armature done, we're going to assemble the rib cage. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and squish our legs down so that they're in a more natural standing position, and squish our wings down. So now when it stands, it actually stands up. So as you can see, our spine, our wire spine, is following the contour of our body. Our legs are attached through that hole. Our wings are in this divot. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to attach this bone together. So we're going to glue it. And then we're going to glue along the spine, making sure that my wing is where it's supposed to be. Line up those bones and attach. Pay close attention. We're gluing this one, not our clavicle. And then once that's dry enough to hold itself in place, I'm going to apply glue just on the inside of this opening and try to sandwich that wire in place. I don't need to put any glue down here with the pelvis because the pelvis is meant to be open. Do not apply any glue onto the clavicle because this is going to be open as well. So we're just applying glue from here down to where the opening stops. And we're going to do that on both sides because we are trying to sandwich that wire in place. Now that that's mostly where it should be, we're going to assemble the clavicle. Now birds have almost a necklace style clavicle that makes a hoop, and it's attached at the bottom. So what we're going to do is we're going to flare this out on either side, and then we're going to loop these, and we're just going to put some glue on that overlap so that it forms almost that necklace style hoop. So we're going to put just a little bit of glue on the underside of one clavicle, just like this, just on that very tip. We're going to overlap it slightly and then squeeze it flat. And after it's dried a little bit, you can check to make sure that it's attached at the angle that we want. We want those to be flat. You see how I have those coming apart? We don't want that. We want it to make a continuous circular shape. Next, we're going to round out our rib cage. Right now it's very two-dimensional. We want to make that nice three-dimensional rounded shape. So we're going to gently pull our wings forward and out of our way. And we're going to take our rib cage with our finger and just kind of gently push out. Bend gently at that sternum. And just kind of rolling it over our finger to encourage it to take that rounded shape. So you see here's the one that has been rounded, and then here's the side that's still flat. So we're going to do this on both sides. And then we're going to glue our sternum together. So we want this to be all aligned. And when we attach these two, we want to put a little extra glue on this point right here because we're going to sandwich it onto that bone. And that's going to force our rib cage to open up. It's amazing how large this sternum is on birds. I had no idea until I was doing research for this project how big that breastbone was. And I'm going to hold this until it is sticking on its own. And while it's drying, I can just kind of reach in and gently round out the shape of that rib cage the way that I want it. Checking the alignment of my sternum pieces. Make sure they're nicely stuck together. All right. And once that's holding on its own, I can let go. And we have a fully assembled torso. Our next step is going to be to assemble our skull. So I'm going to move my body off to one side, and I'm going to get my skull pieces. So the skull is going to be this whole beak piece, the mandible piece, and then we have kind of the main piece that makes up the back of the skull. These are going to be our orbital bones, the ones that go over the eyes. And then this is that kind of central bone that runs along the inside of the skull. We're going to go ahead and detach all of those from the mat. So now for my favorite part, assembling the skull. As usual, we're going to do our very first step, which is folding along all of our score lines. So our beak is going to fold nicely in half. Once again, I'm using an edge just to make sure I have that nice sharp crease. And then I'm going to be folding all of my tabs inside. If you find that your folds are not cooperating as much as you'd like, you can always go back and score them even heavier. Just take your stylus and just draw over the lines that are already there. That can help with some of these more tricky, tight folds, especially these little tiny ones. Now there's all our tabs done. So unfolded, it looks a bit like this. And then once we fold it, all of these tabs are going to attach to make those lovely curves on the beak for us. So this is where it's going to be exceptionally helpful to have a toothpick or some other tool to help us manipulate these tiny pieces. So for the beak, what we're going to do is we're going to apply glue just to these tabs on the beak curve, and then we're going to fold it flat and pinch it shut until those dry. So I'm going to apply glue, just a tiny bit of glue onto those tabs that we just folded. I'm going to take some of that excess off. And then we're going to fold this flat, making sure that we catch those tabs on the inside. So if they're not folding, help those along with a fingernail and pinch it flat. Same thing on the upper beak. We're going to push those in and fold it nice and flat, and then pinch. So when it's completely folded, it's going to look a bit like this. And once it's dry, we can unfold it, and you see that it's going to form this beautiful curve on that beak. While we give that a little extra time to dry, I'm going to go ahead and fold all of the tabs on our main skull piece. Once again, these are very tiny. Once you have all of your tabs folded, it's going to be helpful to manipulate these into a nice little curve. So give each of these arms kind of a slight, gentle curve by just rolling them over the tip of your finger. Because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to stick these together at the back, which is going to form the back of our skull. And then we're going to be attaching these to that orbital bone, which is going to form the front of our skull. We're going to start with this back piece. So as you can see, these fit perfectly. So we're going to apply glue to that, and then we're going to stick them together. To do this the most easily, we're going to want to have a toothpick that we can kind of push down on each of those tabs as we glue them. So I'm going to apply glue onto the piece that's going to attach, and then I'm just going to kind of push down on that tab with my toothpick until it attaches. And I'm going to do that one tab at a time so that it has the best seal possible. I'm going to start with this little tab here and just a little bit of glue, and I'm going to fold it in to where it's supposed to sit. And then I'm just going to put the end of my toothpick down on top of it and hold. And that pressure really helps to make that glue stick. Then I'm going to repeat the process with the other two tabs on that curve, and then I'm going to do it again on this side. And then I'm going to hold that in place. Once again, the toothpick is going to give me a better hold than my fingernail will. If you've got sharper fingernails than me, maybe you can do it with just your nails. And once that's glued, we have that nice curved shape on the inside. I'm going to repeat that with the other side now. And once that's dry, we're going to have this concave, nicely glued shape, or convex if we're looking at it from the outside. The next part we're going to be gluing is that orbital bone. So we're going to take one of our pieces and we're going to line it up and glue each of those tabs in the same way that we did the back of the skull. So one tab at a time, we're going to be gluing each of these along. And you want to make sure that each tab is stuck really well before you move on to the next one. Otherwise, you're going to go back and find that some of your tabs have unglued themselves, which would be bad. All right, and I'm going to show you what this looks like up close. I'm going to repeat the process with the other side. Once your skull is nicely glued and dried, it's going to look like this. So we have almost this Magneto helmet going on. The last thing we have to do with this piece is this back portion. We're going to bend together to give it that nice rounded appearance at the base of the skull. So we're going to take those two ends, we're going to apply glue down one side, and we're going to overlap them and then pinch them in place. This one in particular, I highly recommend having some tweezers on hand to hold that shut because it's very tiny. We're going to sort of pre-bend that a little bit to encourage it to stay in that shape once it's glued. And be careful pre-bending if your glue has not dried, because if you're pre-bending down here, you're putting stress on these that we've just glued. So make sure your stuff is glued really, really well before you move on to this step. All right, and then I'm going to stick those together. And I'm pinching with my fingers and then grabbing my tweezers to hold that end bit together. And then I can just go in and take that excess glue off. I also want to take my tweezers and stick that little wedge portion above the hole closed. And then I'm just going to hold that in place while I wait for that glue to dry a little. And once that's done, you have a nicely rounded back end. It's pretty subtle, but it adds just a little bit more rounding to the skull, which is kind of important if we want it to look like an actual bird skull. Once your glue has really, really dried, you can go in and kind of massage your pieces to give them an even more rounded look. Particularly that orbital bone could do with a little bit of rounding out. So we're just kind of pushing our pieces into more of a spherical shape. Now let's attach our beak to our skull. So if you look at the front of the skull, we have this overhang piece, and that's where this little flat piece at the top of the beak is going to go. So as much as possible, we're going to flare this out and flatten just that very, very top part of the beak. And while we're doing this, that's kind of forcing that curve and that beautiful 3D shape on the beak to come out. We're going to attach it here. And then once that's well attached, we're going to come back and we're going to attach our upper jaw to our orbital bone along the back. And this is going to be to your preference. If you push it up further, you're going to have a more rounded beak along this bone. And if you pull it back, then it's going to be a lot more straight. So find your sweet spot, and that's where you're going to glue it. So I'm going to apply a good amount of glue across the front of my helmet piece, and then stick my beak to that piece. So my glue is not quite dry, but I'm going to show you about where I'm trying to line that up, right about there. And this is another one where it can be very helpful to have a small piece like the toothpick where we can kind of push those glued portions together so they stay nice and adhered. You want those nasal bones kind of out of the way. If you find that your nasal bones are kind of drifting to the inside, what you can do is you can glue them and these jawbone pieces flat by applying a little bit of glue and then pinching them completely flat. So you see now, instead of this bone kind of falling in the way it is, once that glue dries, it's going to stay kind of flush to where it's supposed to be. I'm going to do the same thing with this bone, which is falling in, and I'm going to glue it so that it's sticking up. All right, so now that our beak is attached to our helmet piece at the front, we're going to go in and attach our upper mandible to our orbital bone. So I'm going to find the spot that I want to attach, which is going to be about here, which gives me a nice shape. And then I'm going to apply glue at that overlap point and then pinch it shut. And then as that's drying, I can sort of shape and round out the side of my beak. We're going to repeat the process with the other side. You want to kind of eyeball it and make sure that it is doing the same thing on both sides as much as possible. We know true symmetry doesn't really exist in nature, but we're trying for as close as we can. And here is the top of our skull. We're going to go ahead and attach the lower jaw. So the lower jaw is another one where we are going to be kind of doing this to our preference. So the first thing is we're going to be curving this piece around a round object. I like about the size of my toothpick, and I'm going to curl my paper around it. I don't want there to be a sharp crease there. And we're left with something like this. So you see how we don't have a sharp crease at the tip. Now, our attachment point for the lower jaw is actually going to be on the inside of our upper mandible. So we're going to kind of eyeball this and figure out what placement we want. So whether we want our beak to be more open, whether we want it to be more closed, if we want our bird to have an overbite or an underbite, you're finding where you want that to be positioned. You're going to apply some glue just to this upper portion, and then you're going to stick it in place. You'll repeat the process on the other side to give you as close to a symmetrical look as you can. So I like my beak to be partially open, but not really, really open, with just the slightest underbite. And then I'm going to repeat the process on the other side to give me a nice symmetrical smile. And then I've got my almost fully assembled skull. We're still going to add in our central point, but that's actually going to be what attaches to the central spine. So that's our very last step. I'm going to go ahead and position this so it's standing upright a little better. Move the wings so that they're providing some counterbalance. Go ahead and bend them into the appropriate shape. When you're bending your joints, you really want to put one finger on each position and bend just at that joint. You don't want to be bending from up here because you'll bend it straight out of the paper. So now that we're happy with that position, we're going to take our skull and we're going to thread it onto the spine. So we're actually going to stick that wire straight through that hole at the back. And then just let it rest down and out of the way. Because the next step that we're going to do is we're going to put this piece together, and then we'll put our skull on top of that to finish it off. This is a great point to decide if your neck is the right length. So for me, this neck, I'm going to pose it, keeping in mind that you are going to have about an inch inside the skull. Decide if that's the right length for your neck. If you want to trim some off at this point, now is the time to do it. This is the perfect length for me, so I'm going to just move my skull out of the way, and then I'm going to work on assembling this middle portion. So for the middle portion, we're going to fold along that center score line, and then we're going to flare each of these tabs out. So we want them to make almost a flat connection surface, which is actually what they're going to be. So we're going to flare each of these tabs out, and this is actually what's going to adhere inside the skull. So if we look at this with the skull, you see that it actually fits beautifully right inside. And what we're going to do is we're going to sandwich the wire inside this piece, and then we're going to glue it on the inside of the skull. So each of these tabs is going to attach to the roof of the skull, and that's what's going to attach everything together. So remember, before we attach the wire, our skull needs to be threaded and on that wire, because after we have glued this to the wire, we won't be able to get the skull on. We're going to apply glue all along the inside, and then we're going to align the wire right in the middle of this shape, above these holes. And remember, because we're sandwiching, we want glue on both sides of that. And I've pre-bent my wire so it's about the right shape, but it's not quite there yet. All right, once I'm happy with that, I'm going to stick my wire down, sandwich it in, and glue. Squish it nice and flat, making sure everything lines up nicely and that our wire is fully encased. Once that dries, we're going to flare out those tabs so that they form a flat surface. And we're going to apply glue on all of those. And then we're going to bring our skull up and around and on top of that shape. And we're going to squish it flat. So this is kind of tricky to film, but what we're doing is we have aligned that center dividing thing inside the skull, and we are squishing it along the roof of the skull. So I have my finger inside the skull on that divider, and I'm just pushing down on the roof to make sure those tabs are as stuck as possible. You can also go in with that toothpick trick and push those individual tabs against the roof to give you the best adherence possible. Our little bird is coming along nicely. We have just one more step left to do, and that's going to be to apply all of our vertebrae pieces along the neck and the tail. When looking at the vertebrae on our mat, they're in order that they're going to appear on the spine. So these are going to be our just below the skull, and these are going to be our tailbones. So you see we have two pairs of each shape until we reach the tailbones. So each of the spinal vertebrae that go on the neck have these sort of two-pronged shapes. These that are a single prong, until this last one, are tailbones. So all 8 of these are going on the neck. Let's start with those. When we're preparing to put our spinal vertebrae along the neck and tail, we need to account for how many we need to fit along the shape. So we need to fit 8 different spinal vertebrae, so we need to space them accordingly. The nice thing about our tacky glue is that we can kind of shift them along the neck as we go, so we don't have to be perfectly exact. So we're going to grab our glue and get our first vertebrae off the mat. I'm going to bend it along the score mark. When we're looking at this, we want the prongs to go forward. So this direction on our bird. We want that single bump to be facing backward. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to continue all the way down the neck. Once you have all of your vertebrae on, you want to just double check that everything's lined up nicely and you don't have any excess glue that needs to be scraped off. And then you can do your tailbones. Our 5 tailbones are going to end with no excess wire hanging off. So you're going to space them accordingly and then trim off any excess wire that you may have. So here's our example of a finished tail. And you're going to follow the exact same process that you followed for the neck. With the tail, you want those pointy ends to be pointing backwards and the flat sides to be facing towards the body. Once our last piece is glued on, all that's left is to trim off that little bit of extra wire, and our bird is done. Stick around for some glamour shots, and I hope you enjoy making your own.